In your newsletter, if you remember there at the bottom of the first page, introduces Charles to us, and he is our speaker tonight. It says he's a novelist. He'll tell us about his book. He's an independent filmmaker, specialized in documentary films and videos for both broadcast television and non-broadcast. And then you continue reading about him and the things that he has done. I think one of the best things is he was a Rumsey County boy, and he's my cousin. We're from the Clemmons line, but that makes it great. And he's won awards and all kinds of things. And most importantly, he has developed our website. And so we thank you for that, Charles. And he keeps us up to date on it and keeps the website going and monitors it and everything. So thank you, Charles. And if you would just come and speak.
Well, thank you, Gwen, for that introduction. And I am Charles M. Clemmons, which stands for Moody, son of Alfred. And I'm about as the most Clemmons person you'd ever meet. My mother's mother was Clemmons. My father's great aunt was Clemmons. And so here you go. I'm honored to be here and to talk to you a little bit about the Reconstruction era that followed the Civil War. And I think most people don't know much about what happened, but it was almost as tumultuous as the war itself. Not as many people died, but it wasn't a very happy tale, any more than the Civil War itself was a very happy story. But I think talking about it can give us a broader perspective on how our country evolved. 10 years ago, I had very little understanding of what Reconstruction was all about or how it had impacted our history. I've been interested in my family's history in Brunswick County since I was about 15. Over the years, I've researched written records and conducted several interviews with my father, aunts, uncles, cousins, and those interviews produce an outline of family oral history that still intrigues me until this day. All of those experiences together have inspired me to write a novel of historical fiction that describes the actual history and at least fictionally emotes the atmosphere of the family's oral history. The stories in the book are only very loosely inspired by my family and do not necessarily present actual facts or events. That part of the book is fictional. There's a background of actual events and actual facts that serves as a background, but the story about the people themselves that are involved in this tale is made up for the most part. Tonight I'll be representing the general timeline of the Civil War and Reconstruction events and facts, the actual facts, and then I'll talk a little bit about the book itself and how those facts serve as a background for the story. And then I'll talk about some of the details and how my research worked its way into the book itself. And as we go through the timeline, I'll try to mention those events that are included in the book. Usually they're indicated by an asterisk. So exactly what was Reconstruction? Well, it refers to the period following the Civil War up until 1877. And it was instituted by the Lincoln Republicans. Anybody know what a Lincoln Republican is? Well, Lincoln was a Republican, and he was the first Republican president. And the folks that were affiliated with the Republican Party at that time, most of them wanted to put an end to slavery. And Lincoln was their candidate. And then when Lincoln won the election, that was the spark that started the Civil War. But there are different groups within the Republican Party. At that time, there was a more, I guess you call them liberal, I don't know if that's the right word or not, but those were the abolitionists, the people who were die-hard, we want to change everything. And they were, in the beginning at least, that was their primary objective. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there were people like Andrew Johnson, for example, who was a Southerner himself, who was perhaps more conservative, and he wanted to move more slowly, and he didn't want a lot of change. Well, and then Lincoln was kind of in the middle. He was more of a moderate, you might say, but those lines of demarcation actually got emphasized once we got into the war itself and into the era following the war. So the idea of a Reconstruction referred to reconstructing the South. And there were two essential parts. One was they wanted to help the former Confederate states recover from the war and reintegrate into the United States. And they also wanted to give the former slaves citizenship rights through constitutional amendments and otherwise to help the slaves adapt to their new state of freedom and citizenship. Now, this, of course, only applied to the former slaves who were men. Women didn't get citizenship rights until 1920. So we'll start the timeline. One of the, of course, the thing that started the war, or basically the military part of the war anyway, was in 1861 in April. Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston and the first military action of the war. In July, the 20th Infantry Regiment with men from Brunswick County is assembled in Smithville and Fort Caswell. Of course, now it's called Southport. The 20th Infantry Regiment, and I'll have to rely on Glenn here because he knows a lot more about this than I do. I tried to find out as many as I could regiments and companies and battalions and so forth that were manned by people from Brunswick County. And these are the ones I came up with. I don't think they're necessarily all of them. 20th would later participate in the Maryland campaign in Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, and Gettysburg. In August, John W. Galloway is commissioned in Brunswick County to create a detachment of volunteers to act as coastal guards, a land-based unit to defend the coast of the Cape Fear region. And my granduncles, Joseph Silas Clemmons, was in that, they also called the Galloway Raiders. August, this is 1861, Union forces captured Fort Hatteras, and they go on to capture Fort Macon and occupy the region around New Bern and Beaufort. This was the first region retaken from the Confederacy and placed under Union control in the war. It became a safe haven for runaway slaves from other areas in North Carolina and the South, other parts of the South. This gentleman is Robert R. Lee from Onslow County, and he was among many white Southerners who joined the Union Army in the years following the fall of Fort Hatteras and Fort Macon. The Union forces were still in control of that region. With the Union in control of the New Bern region, runaway slaves now had a much shorter underground railroad to freedom. This sketch is of Fernie Bryant. I don't know if he was a runaway or not, but he was one of the first black soldiers in the U.S. Army. 1861 September, the 31st Infantry Regiment with men from Brunswick County is organizing at Wilmington. The unit would be captured in February 1862 at Roanoke Island. After some prisoner exchanges, it would then be reassigned for the duration of the war. The 31st would fight at Whitehall, Battery Wagner, Cold Harbor, Petersburg, and Bentonville. And if you saw the movie Glory, You know that Battery Wagner was the fort that they tried to take at the end of the movie. October, the 30th Infantry Regiment, also with men from Brunswick County, is organized at Cape Magnet near Raleigh. It would serve in the Army of Northern Virginia and see action from Seven Pines to Cold Harbor, the Shenandoah Valley, the Maryland Campaign, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, and the Appomattox operations at the end of the war. May of 1862, the 36th Regiment Infantry with men from Brunswick County was unofficially organized in 1861, but it would not be officially organized until May of 1862. After the capture at Fort Fisher, it would serve at Bentonville and surrender with the Army of Tennessee in 1865, according to my research. And we all recognize this man. President Lincoln in 1863 announces the so-called Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction. And in his proposal, he would pardon and restore property to Confederates who would swear to allegiance to the Union and agree to accept emancipation. It also would require that only 10% of a former Confederate state's voters pledge the oath before the state began the process of readmission. So his threshold was 10% of the people in the state could approve, so take the oath, and that would be enough for them to start the process to be readmitted to the Union. Of course, this is in 1863. They were already thinking about what's going to happen after this is over. And of course, they didn't even know they were going to win the war at that time. 1864, in response to Lincoln's plan, Congress passes its own bill with other mandates. It increases the allegiance requirement from 10% to a majority of the state's voters. It limits many former Confederates from political participation in state reconstruction. It demands blacks receive not only their freedom, but also equality before the law. Now, Lincoln does not sign the bill, and it effectively vetoes it. And why would he do that? I think it goes back to that he was really a moderate. And his primary objective was to preserve the Union. And he wanted to make it less restrictive than some members of his own party in readmitting the Southern states into the Union. So his proposal was 10%. They're saying it's got to be at least 50%. And they also ordered these other mandates. Throughout the entire period from 1865, the end of the war, to 1877, two groups, what were called carpetbaggers and scalawags, who exploit the former Confederate states for financial, political, and social gain. Now, who were they? Who were the carpetbaggers? Does anyone know who the carpetbaggers and the scalawags were? They had very similar objectives, but the carpetbaggers were the ones that came down from up north. So they just came in. Still, some people still use that term. So they were outside the area. Scalawags was the locals who were trying to do the same thing that the carpetbaggers were doing. Southerners generally saw both groups as unfairly capitalizing on the chaos following the war and conniving to get blacks to vote and hold office. In this cartoon here, we see a Napoleon-looking carpetbagger riding the back of Lady Solid South while Union troops protect him. 1865, or by 1865, some 180,000 blacks have served in the Union Army. That's over 20% of the adult male black population under age 45 at the time. In January 1865, now this is very close to the end of the war, of course, course. We're talking about just the last few months of the war. General William T. Sherman issues his Special Field Order 15 that is intended to give free blacks 40-acre land plots and some Army mules. The order became known as 40 Acres and a Mule. January 1865, the 3rd Battalion Junior Reserves, Glenn, correct me if I'm wrong, 3rd Battalion Junior Reserves is formed by consolidating 3 other Junior Reserve battalions. 3rd Regiment. Okay. And these were boys and men, some from Boones County, between the ages of 15 and 18, who had defended Fort Fisher. They would serve in Kinston, Smithfield, and Bentonville. Note that Smithfield is not Smithville. Smithfield's up close to where I grew up. In January 1865, Fort Fisher falls to Union troops and naval forces. It's the last remaining major barrier to the fall of Wilmington. This photo shows so-called colored troops serving at Fort Fisher with the white supervising officer. February, Confederate General Braxton Bragg retreats from Wilmington, and the last remaining Confederate supply port falls to Union forces. Anyone else know what General Bragg is famous for?
Not defending Fort Fisher.
I'm sorry? Not defending Fort Fisher. I was thinking Fort Bragg.
Yeah, Fort Bragg. Yeah.
Well, it's not Fort Bragg anymore, I guess. But
Fort Bragg would be split to today.
But I've read that he wasn't that well respected of his own troops. Is that true?
He also messed up. He was sent to West Virginia to try to get it into the Confederacy in the early time of the war, and he messed up that project too. The Union moved in and kept the West Virginia legislature from meeting, and so he didn't succeed in his efforts in West Virginia either.
Yeah, that's good. That's good enough. Well, it's not good enough. But in March of 1865, the Freedmen's Bureau is established in the U.S. War Department to provide relief to help formerly enslaved people become self-sufficient. Among other responsibilities, the Bureau issues rations and clothing, operates hospitals and refugee camps, and supervises labor contracts between planters and freed people. And they assist benevolent and religious groups to establish schools. On the left up there is a picture of one of the schools. These schools are not public schools. They were formed by or organized by religious groups from the North who came down to help educate the former slaves. Until Union forces controlled areas in the South, educating former slaves was illegal. Once the Union forces were in control of areas, they were able to establish these schools. They were open to whites and blacks, but generally no whites attended. The Freedmen's Bureau eventually would establish nearly 3,000 schools, serving over 150,000 students in the South. April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrenders to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Although most historians consider the surrender at the end of the Civil War, but other surrenders and guerrilla warfare would follow for another 2 months at least, including resistance in the North Carolina mountains and ending in Texas in June of 1865. April of 1865, April 15th, President Lincoln is assassinated. His vice president, Southerner Andrew Johnson, who was born in Raleigh. They still have his house up there if you haven't seen it. I think they moved it, though. I'm not sure it's in the same place. Anyway, he became president. And then on April 26th, Confederate General Johnston, not Johnson, surrenders almost 90,000 troops to Union General Sherman at Bennett Place near what is now Durham. It was the final surrender of official Confederate armies and the largest single troop surrender of the war. So at this point, we know that the first territory that was retaken from the Confederacy by Union forces was Fort Hatteras in 1861. This surrender at Bennett Place was the last territory, if you will, retaken by the Union. And both of those occurred in North Carolina. So that pretty much marks the end of the war. I just wanted to quote some numbers for you about the casualties in the war, if you're not familiar with this. I'm reading from the book. Civil War casualty estimates vary, but about 620,000 military personnel were killed or died of disease during the war. Fully 476,000 were wounded and 400,000 were declared missing. Perhaps as many as 100,000 civilians died from combat, disease, or starvation. Over 1 million horses and mules were killed. Casualty estimates do not include those who came home psychologically damaged. The war wounds of mental illness were not part of the medical and social vocabulary of the 1860s. 1865, May. President Johnson announces his plan for Reconstruction. His plan calls for general amnesty and restoration of property to all white Southerners who swear loyalty to the Union. Johnson declares that large landowners and the former Confederate leadership are required to petition him personally for pardons. Why do you think Johnson wanted Confederate leadership and landowners to petition him personally?
Was he one of them?
Could be that he wanted to be rewarded for his pardons. I don't know, maybe. Possibility. August, September, President Johnson orders the restoration of land, Southern land, to its former owners. And that included the land provided to freed slaves by General Sherman's 40 acres in the Buell Order. Johnson starts aligning himself with the Southern elite. He declared, white men alone must manage the South. That same fall, Southern states elect former Confederates to public office at state and national levels and refuse to extend the vote to black men. Southern legislatures began drafting what they called black codes to reestablish white supremacy. Some believe that the new laws amount to slavery without the chain. The image on the right here is a cover sheet for sheet music for an election campaign song that's entitled The White Man's Banner. Anybody know that song? 1865, December. President Johnson declares that his Reconstruction process complete. That's after only 7 months after he started his Reconstruction plan in May. So he got it over real fast. Okay, radical Republicans in Congress are, I guess you would call them, the guys who really wanted to change everything. They refused to recognize a lot of the new governments in the southern states. They didn't like the way it was going. More than 60 former Confederates arrive to serve in Congress. The clerk of the House refuses to include them in his roll call, and they are denied their elected seats. In December, in the image at the right of the screen, federal troops in the South are demobilized. From 1 million soldiers on May 1st, troops are cut to only 152,000 by the end of 1865. Also in December, the 13th Amendment is ratified, abolishing slavery throughout the United States. 1866, May, racial violence rages in Memphis, Tennessee for 3 days. Blacks are assaulted in the streets. 48 people, nearly all black, are dead, and hundreds of black homes, churches, and schools have been pillaged or burned. July, riots break out in New Orleans. A white mob attacks blacks and radical Republicans attending a black suffrage convention, killing 40 people. And in the fall, federal troops are further demobilized. There are only 38,000 that still remain in the South. 1868, July, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution is ratified, granting citizenship to all people born or naturalized in the U.S., including formerly enslaved people. It also guaranteed all citizens equal protection under the law. September 1868, black elected officials are ousted from the Georgia State Legislature. The Atlanta Constitution declares the Negro is unfit to rule the state. President Grant finally is able to get the legislators readmitted a year later. April 1869, the Supreme Court decides that radical Reconstruction is constitutional and secession from the Union is illegal. And I think what radical Reconstruction here means corresponds to the radical Republicans. It was really what they wanted, and the court agreed with it. In fall of the same year, violence against black continues through the South. In October, a Georgia legislator is kidnapped and whipped. So there was a lot of violence. 1870, February, the 15th Amendment is ratified. It mandates that the right to vote cannot be denied based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. April of 1871, the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871 is enacted. Now let's see what that was all about. KKK violence was intense in South Carolina. 11 murders and more than 600 whippings and assaults occurred in just one county. President Grant signed the KKK Act to outlaw any efforts to deny rights to any citizens. Grant declared martial law and suspended habeas corpus, denying accused terrorists the right to a full trial. 600 Klansmen are jailed, more than 200 indicted, and 53 plead guilty. After the KKK Act, Klan terrorism diminished considerably until the early part of the 20th century. But other groups rose up to take their place. For example, the so-called red shirts. The Colfax massacre occurs. What happened was the so-called White League, which was a paramilitary group intent on securing white rule in Louisiana, clashes with Louisiana's almost all black state militia. So what do you think? Louisiana's state militia was almost all black. Well, Louisiana was one of those places where the carpetbaggers came in, and it was perceived that they were getting the legislature, getting blacks elected to the legislature. So the legislature itself was predominantly black. So the militia was black. In that so-called massacre, only 3 members of the White League died, but some 100 black men are killed. More than half, were murdered after they surrendered. March of 1877 is the date of the Compromise of 1877, which results from disputed votes in the presidential election of 1876. And in that election of 1876, a Republican, Rutherford B. Hayes, ran against Democrat Samuel Tilden. And Hayes wins by 1 electoral college vote. But 20 electoral votes are disputed in 3 southern states and Oregon. Louisiana, again, Florida and South Carolina votes are perceived by Democrats to be illegitimate because their legislatures were majority black. So they couldn't quite agree on who won the race, even though there was 1 vote margin for Hayes. So they appointed a congressional commission to resolve the issue, and they compromised. Democrats agreed to let Hayes be president with 2 main conditions. One is that all U.S. military forces must be removed from the South, and 2, southern states must be able to deal with blacks without outside interference. I'm not sure what kind of compromise that is, but this is the way some people interpreted this cartoon. The statement on the sketch says, Tilden or blood. In other words, the choice presented to the commission was between making Tilden president or continuing bloodshed in the South. The commission chose Hayes as president and a hands-off attitude toward violence, being against violence toward blacks in the South. And that was the compromise. They wanted Hayes as a president, but they also wanted a hands-off attitude in the South. And that's what happened. So in the compromise, the most important outcome was that Reconstruction was essentially ended. Segregation and discrimination against blacks is codified and enforced primarily in the former Confederate states. And bigotry and violence against black continues unabated. Violations of black civil rights will not command national attention at least until another 80 years. So that was the end of Reconstruction. I was talking to Glenn earlier about this picture, 1908. Most of them, or maybe all of you, have seen this photo of Brunswick Civil War veterans made in 1908. There's at least one of my great-great-grandfathers, a great-great-granduncle, and a granduncle in there. Today, we may see the world differently than they did in the context of the situation and culture 100 and 160 years ago. But our ancestors were brave and diligent men and women, and I think we should honor them through this photo as historical record. Now I'd like to move on to provide some brief highlights of my novel, this one, and how it grew out of my research of the Reconstruction era. The book's title is Ayla's Journal, A Tale of Southern Reconstruction, and it covers the period from 1864, at the end of the Civil War, through the end of Reconstruction, and up to the year 1919. I'd like to give you a brief synopsis of the book and then go on to talk about its background, its inspiration, and sources underlying the story. In 1864, 2 13-year-old girls meet on James Sanders' small farm just south of Wilmington. Ayla Mackenzie is an indentured servant, and Mary Jane Sanders is a slave. The end of the Civil War has left the South, the community, and personal lives in shambles. Jubilation over the emancipation of slaves is replaced by oppression, discrimination, hatred, and violence directed toward blacks and their sympathizers. The 2 women suffer similar abuse and struggle together with hardship through Reconstruction and into the early 20th century. In Wilmington's election of 1898, mostly so-called fusionists were elected to city government positions. Anyone know who the fusionists were?
Daniel Russell was part of that at one time.
Yeah, that's not surprising, I guess. It was a coalition between Republicans, black folks, and poor white folks. The fusionists basically were successful in that election, and conservative white Democrats became incensed over an editorial in the Wilmington Black newspaper that they believed insulted white womanhood. They also didn't like the results of the election that put the fusionists in power. Motivated by their anger, they overthrew the duly elected Wilmington government and replaced its officers with conservative Democrats. In that coup d'etat, many black people were killed or driven into the countryside. We don't know how many. There have been estimates all over the place. It's hard to tell really how many people were affected. So a lot of them just evacuated Wilmington and into the countryside. The fictional part of the story in the book, Ayla and Mary Jane's families were swept up in the Wilmington tragedy. That's why I mentioned it at this point. Through their continued shared hardship and life experiences, Ayla and Mary Jane become lifelong friends. Sources for the novel and origins of the story. I'll begin with Mary Jane and her son, Boo Boo. In the fictional story, Boo Boo is Mary Jane's son, fathered by the slave overseer on James Sanders' farm. Now, the reason the Boo Boo is in there and Mary Jane is in there, give a little background on that. I grew up on North Carolina Forest Service tree nursing on what is now an educational state forest near Clayton, 10 miles east of Raleigh. My father was the supervisor of the nursery, and he hired groups of mostly black workers, women, I think they were all women, from town to come out and pull the weeds out of the seedling seed beds. Among the folks who came out to work was a lady named Mary Jane Sanders, who brought her son with her. She called him Boo Boo. I'm pretty sure that wasn't his real name. But Boo, in a southern term of endearment, as most of you probably know. So he was kind of a double. I was about 8 at the time, and Boo Boo was a little older than I. We played cowboys and Indians while Mary Jane worked. My recollection is that I wanted to be the Indian because the Indian was kind of the underdog hero, so to speak. And Boo Boo wanted to be the hero cowboy. In retrospect, Boo Boo may have wanted to play the hero because it was so far from the life that he knew. The book also contains some influences from my own family history. I developed an interest in my family history at an early age. When I was about 15, both my mother and my father were born and grew up in Brunswick County, where their ancestors go back at least 250 years. I traveled to Brunswick with my parents and siblings to visit relatives many times over the years, and I've collected oral histories of my ancestors and interviewed my father, several living aunts, uncles, and cousins. Several characteristics and stories in the novel were inspired by my family members and their oral history. I say inspired because the characters and the stories in the book only very loosely reflect the real people and their oral history. Part of my research for the book included lifeways, religion, and language dialects of the Brunswick region. The intent was to help make the characters seem real to the reader by reflecting who and what those folks were, their characteristics, cultural beliefs, values, religion, and attitudes. One part of it had to do with how they spoke. And significant effort was put into reflecting their language and dialect in the story. I tried to reflect three types of speech, what I would call country white folks, slaves and former slaves, and the third group would be so-called Yankee speech. Country white folks in the book speak the dialect of my father. His speech reflected a Scots-Irish twang, as if he had come from the mountains, but more likely he was influenced by the Scots-Irish who migrated up from South Carolina. I had two primary sources for the speech of the slaves, the former slaves. One was a collection of early 20th century interviews with former slaves that were contained and still are contained in the Library of Congress. A second source was closer to my home when I was growing up. When as a child, I knew a black sharecropper named Tootsie, who lived about a mile from us down the road in what had been an antebellum plantation. I'm convinced that Tootsie spoke the language of his enslaved ancestors. Tootsie is also the name I gave to one of the slave characters in the book. And there were a few characters from Yankee land in the book, and I tried to represent the northern dialect. My view is that these dialects are as legitimate as standard English. It was important to me that characters speak as they would in real life. To have everyone speak standard English actually would seem to be insulting to all three groups. Now a word about the actual historical research of the events. While the individual characters and their experiences in the novel partially and loosely based on family and their stories, they are essentially fictional. The actual history that serves as a story backdrop had to be factually accurate. Research into several events was extensive, but inevitably not all historical accounts completely agree with each other. For this reason, some historical details are just left out. And in some cases, only facts that have some sort of a basis of consensus are represented. In conclusion, I'd like to clarify a couple of my main reasons for writing the book. First, having researched my family history and learned so much about the times and the hardships that my ancestors faced and overcame, I felt an obligation to honor them for their inspiration. Also, for me, Ayla's Journal is a work of introspection. Its primary purpose is to encourage examination of history's relevance to our values today. I should note that the hardcover version of the book is available in all of the Brunswick County branch libraries. Both hard and softcover versions are also available through your favorite local independent bookstore, as well as Barnes & Noble, Target, and Amazon. And if you like the book, give it a good review. Thank you all for coming tonight. I hope my talk has been interesting and enlightening for everyone. Now we can open it up to questions.
You mentioned the red shirts. They come from Wadesboro down here. Where the uprising started. That's where the red shirts come from.
I had a picture of, there were a group of red shirts. I forget where the town was. It was about 120 miles. Wadesboro?
Anson County. They got on the old Seaboard, Seaboard airline.
Well, they had red shirts here too.
Oh yeah, but it was a small chapter. They thought they got red.
That was the main one over there.
It was good called Wilton Uprising, something like that. About 2018, it was detailed. Can't remember the road. I got one copy of it.
Yeah, it was a difficult period for our country. In many ways, the Civil War was still going on, and but Reconstruction was basically it wasn't a total failure in terms of what they wanted to happen, but it was very difficult.
Have you ever come across a book by a man named Joyner? I can't remember the name of the book. It was something like a fence rails and something. I can't remember the whole title of the book, but
What's it about?
it was about Reconstruction. Centered around Reconstruction in North Carolina.
Yeah.
He teaches in, I'm pretty sure he teaches in California now. But
I don't know.
I don't know the book, but his last name was Joyner, and it was something like fence rails and something. But it was all about Reconstruction.
Well, I remember Reconstruction in school. I don't remember much about it. I remember carpetbaggers and scalawags. That's something you don't forget, I don't think.
For your, I guess, personal research with the oral history that you recorded, is that available somewhere online in a printed version?
Some of it is online. On the Berks County Historical Society website, there are some interviews that I did with my father, my uncle John Smith, and his two of his sisters. And when do I have yours on there?
I don't know.
I don't think I have yours on there.
Yeah, you interviewed me.
It wasn't. Yours wasn't video.
Yes.
Was it?
Yeah.
AW is interviewed on there.
Oh.
Yeah.
Boyd McKeithen.
Boyd McKeithen.
From the standpoint of getting, I guess, the perspective of your characters who start out, I guess, as teenage girls when this story starts, the journals, I guess, that would have been produced at the time would have been produced mostly by well-educated aristocracy who would not have shared the same views as their characters. Have you ever come across journals of actual people who would represent your characters from that time?
No. The journal that's implied here, there doesn't exist. It was a journal that was made up, but it was her recordings of her experiences as she went through, and she probably wasn't typical of most people who went through that period. If you've read the book, it's you've got people who are part of the violence that went on, and you've got people who were the other extreme, and she was kind of in the other extreme. There probably weren't too many people like her, but she wouldn't have normally been educated enough to even want to write a journal, in my opinion. She probably didn't know what my journal was. But I had the character from Pennsylvania who seemed to be more educated, that she gave her the idea. But it was, you wouldn't expect people like these characters to necessarily be, to have actually existed, I don't think.
There's a little piece of family folklore in the Fulford family here in Brunswick County. Involves my great-great-grandmother. After the war, at the time there was a Freedmen's Bureau supply station set up in Watkins Folly. And the family lore says that she went to reclaim food that had been stolen from her smokehouse. And she and another woman went to reclaim food and to the Freedmen's Bureau supply depot. And they says they went armed, whatever that was supposed to be, and were able to get supplies. They said to reclaim what had been stolen from the smokehouse. That was some folklore in the Fulford family.
Yeah.
And
Fulford?
They
You just say Fulford?
Fulfords together.
Well, the Freedmen's Bureau
Anzi.
kind of disappeared at the end of Reconstruction. I don't think it really kept going after that. But talking about the oral history and the interviews and so forth, there's one story in the book that is pretty close to an actual story. One of my uncles, I don't think I should probably identify him, but he told the story of they had a cow that disappeared, and his father said, well, I can't find it. He said, I can't find the cow. Where's the cow? He said, well, you better go out and look for the buzzards. So he went out and looked for the buzzards, and she was in a swamp somewhere, partially submerged. She died, and the calf was there still trying to nurse. And he took the calf home, and his father told him that if he raised the calf, it could be his calf, and he could sell it, when it became an adult, he could sell it, do whatever he wanted to. Sure enough, when it did grow up and became I don't know if it was a male or female, but whatever, his father took the calf and sold it without his knowledge. So that story is almost exactly the way it actually occurred in his story, his version of it. Most of them are kind of hinted at. There are some stories also from my own immediate family that are pretty close to being the real thing. But most of them are just taken as inspiration, and then I just tried to blend them into the rest of the story. But yeah, those interviews, they're golden. They're just, if anyone is alive now that, later on in their age, you better go get the interview. It doesn't have to be a video. Most of mine were video interviews, but get a recording. Get those stories and keep them.